Hey everybody. So it's been a while. I was in Asia for 2 months and I've been, looking at certain things and trying to figure out more about the developing countries and looking for investment opportunities over there. So yeah, I was busy and yeah, with that being said, I'm gonna try to make more videos. So none of this is financial advice. Please do your own research. Anything I've ever said, anything I will continue to say is a joke at best. It's just my opinion. So yeah, none of this is financial advice. I'm not a professional of any sort. I'm just an idiot sharing their opinion. Okay, so with that being said, I just want to start this video off by going over numerous topics, mainly because there's a lot of things I want to talk about and there's a lot of videos I want to make, but they're like very specific. So because of that, I'm just gonna go over things on the top of my head, and then maybe later on I'll make more videos that are very specific to something. So the whole thing with Maduro and Venezuela, it looked relatively smooth when you compare it to like other times in history where the United States has invaded a country. So it's very eerily similar to when Soleimani was assassinated on January 3rd, except, Maduro was taken captive on January 3rd, 2026, and Soleimani was assassinated on January 3rd, 2020, before the market crash of the, I don't want to talk, I can't say the word, it's censored. So very interesting. There's a lot of the underlying problems that we see in the economy that are very eerily similar as well, but I don't know for sure, because there's a lot of things you could point to that are very similar and a lot of things that are different as well. So I'm going to be talking let's see, we'll go through this one first. So Venezuela has a bunch of natural resources, a lot of minerals, a lot of energy resources as well, and they're right next to Brazil, so that's something to consider. When looking at first, second, third world countries, I understand that China is often painted as a country that is a near peer adversary to the United States, but there's a lot of countries that are too. It's not just China. There's many, and when you look at China, like, yeah, there are some amazing parts. When I visited Asia recently, yeah, there's like really really developed parts, but there's also places that aren't as developed as well. And to me, there's a lot of news going on where it's like hyper sensationalization of like wars or tensions and drama. But to me, overall, I think that yes, there are a lot of there's a lot of instability, but at the same time, when you have over 8 billion people in this world and there's a lot of things changing, you sometimes need the instability because that just comes hand in hand with change, right, and growth. So overall, I think these countries are growing and doing better over time, and we would hope so, right? If we're considering the UN Charter, if we're considering the sustainable development goals, you want these countries to develop over time. So first, second, and third world countries all have like their own set of expertise, and I'm not going to talk about the morality of things too much, but eventually you do want each country to develop. So like Vietnam, for example, right here. So it's a third world country, but a lot of Vietnam is very developed. A lot of it is not. I would assume that generally most countries in this world want increased global liquidity because that means they can find better financing. They want the demand side to go up as well, from like all these countries, so production moves up as well. And so deflation in China, for example, is a good thing, but you want overall, like, I guess the best of both worlds for a large part of the third and second world country, but yet like in between, especially third world, is increased global liquidity under favorable means. So that means like they're not getting ripped off as much, better access to capital and investments opportunities and financing and more demand side. So like the products, goods, and services that these countries produce are in higher demand, right? So it's hard when you have things like tariffs. It's also hard when you have sanctions. It's hard when you have all these like trade restrictions being placed by a lot of the first world countries because they want to ensure that as the world develops that they have the right measures in place that they can benefit from it and that they can benefit from global growth, right? I mean, ideally, you would want all these countries to be on par as a first world country. At the same time, this world does have finite resources. We do have to consider, like, the sustainable development goals, climate change, pollution, things like that, and the limited demand. Well, there's always a lot of demand, but, you know, even if the world and the news hyper sensationalizes drama, we have to remember that most countries in this world, smaller ones without nuclear weapons, larger ones with nuclear weapons, they all have to play within a framework, right? So like the furthest extreme of turbulence would be global nuclear exchange, which is like 5 billion plus people die. So that's like extreme. Like if countries can't get along together, you have nuclear weapons and nuclear wars. So it's really, in my opinion, it's really impossible for countries like China or the United States to war over things like Taiwan, or Japan and China to war. Like, these things just don't make sense to me, because at the end of the day, most countries just want peace, and it's like the best alternative. It's like the best option. So my prediction is that the world will develop relatively peacefully. There's going to be unfortunate casualties. It's not fair. I know, but we're going to have a world that everyone in the end eventually prospers, because we have to. Because if you don't, then you have a lot of consequences, right? Like if these countries don't get a better quality of life, you have mass migration into developing countries, which strains the first world countries. Then you also have things like political and economic instability, which cannot be contained within these countries. You also have more wars and disputes, and you also have a neglect on trade, or you have a neglect on wanting to participate within the global economy. So yeah, eventually you're going to want all these countries to do well, because it's the most sustainable path towards global development in a sustainable way, which means like the sustainable development goals are actually adhered to. So you want these things, but again, like, countries do want to benefit from the global growth, right? Like, let's just say that you had BRICS, or if you had some kind of organization that was like, we're all going to develop, like the colonized world is going to develop without the United States and its Western powers and Western allies that have been like imperialist or colonialist. Like, that's not sustainable, because it's true that a lot of people in the past and even now do terrible things, but most people, like you and I, we're not bad people. We're just people trying to live, right? So we have brothers and sisters all around the world who feel like us. We just want, Maslow's hierarchies needs to be met, and we just want to have a peaceful development. So yeah, you can't just isolate the United States, because that's when they start using like imperialism. That's when they start turning towards colonialism. That's when they start turning towards military expansion, because they want to force things open with gunboat diplomacy. So it's actually in everyone's best interest to get along and develop. Now, countries without nuclear weapons unfortunately cannot stand up for themselves as much, but at the same time, in the long run, you would hope that as the world develops, then maybe there'll be more powers that can help everyone. So like, if you have one unipower global system like the United States, then yeah, the world's going to develop very unfairly, right? Where capital flows and resources will flow into the United States, and they're going to pretty much like, seize all the resources. So when you have other powers rise, like in China or Japan in the 70s, well, they're under United States control. Yeah, but if you have like countries like China or Russia, or even sometimes the Europeans, and other countries of nuclear weapons and strong military and strong economic production, manufacturing capabilities, then you start having a more fair world, because smaller countries can choose between which powers they want to join, or be in between both, and like benefit from the best of both worlds, and just increase demand. Right? So if like one country treats you bad, you can alliance with one or both, or they can constantly bid for a better deal. So if you were, I don't know, if you were like Venezuela, for example, and China is weak and Russia is weak, then you're kind of beholden to the United States. But when the world develops more and China has more power and Russia has more power and Japan has more power, or Australia, yeah, it doesn't really matter, or even Brazil has more power, or Mexico, then you can choose between like different types of trade deals you want to make, which one's best optimal for you, what kind of deals do you want to make globally and politically and geopolitically. And it just basically, it's like a free market in a sense, right? Like if you only have one person bidding for your goods you're selling, then yeah, you're going to get a bad deal. But if you have 2 or 3 or 4, then there's more people, the demand side for you increases. So you can bargain for better deals. So eventually you do want all these countries, and it's in everyone's best interest to move up into second and first world. But you also have to understand that when these countries move up in the value ladder, things change at a very deep, like everything changes from like inside out. So countries have to adapt to this. So like if China develops and they start joining the electric vehicle export, and they start exporting things like technologies, chips, and higher quality goods, like countries have to adapt. So maybe like the United States will move towards financialization, for example, and maybe Japan will too. And China will move towards more manufacturing higher quality goods, and places like Vietnam or Thailand will focus more on like, they'll move into things like that as well. Like Vietnam's VinFast, but they're still developing, and maybe they focus more on like resources, like exports, like commodities, or textiles and things like that. So it's like a chain, right? Everyone eventually want to get to a point where everyone's a first world, but you can't. There's just you have to do it in a way that is sustainable. Now, if you're in a second or third world country, you don't really care what I have to say, because it's not fair, and I understand that. It's not like, if you consider PPP, it's not fair if like someone in Vietnam is making like $8 equivalent an hour, like $8 USD per day, and Americans are making like, I don't know, like 16 to $30 an hour. Like, it's not really fair. There's a lot of opportunities for arbitrage. I understand that, but the hope is that eventually the world will become more fair and more prosperous for everybody. And the truth is, I think that's what's going on right now. We're in that phase where things are adjusting. Second world countries are moving towards first world. Third world countries are moving towards second. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, but then there's a lot of certainty too. I think a lot of this is already understood. I think a lot of the central planners, governments around the world, economists, I think they understand this, right? So a lot of these things just take time. And so when you have daily news and you have dramatizations and you have access to information, like Well, people are always trying to make money off something, so when you watch things like the news, like they always have to have something going on, right? Rather than be like, rather than maybe in world, like post World War II, right, under Bretton Woods, like people understood that, there's going to be global development towards a certain way, and this is just an inevitable outcome by 2050 or 2100. You need to have daily news for whatever reasons, to distract the masses, to monetize the news, to have the world develop in a certain way. So when I sometimes think about things like, was this all in like the master plan of things, right? Maybe, who knows, right? But if we're just considering like sustainable development goals, the UN Charter, the World Economic Forums, and what is best for everyone, not just what first world countries think, but in the best interest of first, second, and third, like the global society, what is the best for them? Well, you have this messy path, but eventually it's moving towards north. Even if sometimes it goes east, sometimes it goes west, sometimes it goes a little bit south, eventually it's heading north, and you'd hope that things get better in the long run. And there's a lot of creative ways that it's done, and not everyone agrees with it, but it's eventually going to happen there. And it's not in my place to say like what is right or what is wrong, right? So yeah. So the largest steel producer is China, and then you have Japan that acquired U.S. Steel. So to me, when I view things like Venezuela, it just seems to me like eventually the United States, they need China. They need Chinese. They need to do business with China, because China owns a lot of the means of production. They're in like one of the best places globally to have resources all around them. They have a lot of the developing countries around them as well. So these are like potential markets, right? And the United States, the way it is, it's like it's in a phase where it's developed already, and this is the blueprint of how countries maybe kind of generally will go: manufacture, third, second, first, financialization, and then sustainability. And there's nothing really wrong with that in the long run, because you'd kind of hope that everybody sort of goes towards that way. So you have like sustainable development. I'm not saying anything is good about it though, but yeah. So yeah, like when we look at things like GDP per capita, yeah, places like Venezuela haven't been doing so well, but eventually you do want countries to rise, right? You want their GDP per capita to rise as well. So look at this. We have the world oil production right here. Now when you look at this, right, so eventually there's a lot of climate change initiatives that focus on reducing natural gases and natural oils. And ideally this is what you want if you believe in things like climate change and sustainable developments. I think living in the United States, we don't really consider like air quality or pollution or rising water levels or global warming, because we are in a first world country, so we don't really feel a lot of these like negative consequences. But traveling Asia, for example, I mean, yeah, it's very apparent in poorer countries that all these things from like CO2 production and carbon emissions they actually are pretty harmful. Like, so like the air is hard to breathe. It's very toxic. Rising water levels and global temperature rising. You take these things for granted, because in the United States you can just buy your way towards a cleaner area, or you can move away towards somewhere cleaner, or you can you don't feel a lot of the consequences here because we're very lucky environmentally and geographically. But when you are in a poor country, you can't really afford to avoid the consequences of heavy CO2 emissions. So people have their own theory on this, but I'm just saying that, poorer countries and developing countries feel the brunt more because they can't afford not to. Okay, so you don't have to, whatever, if you agree with me or not, I don't really care. I'm just saying, like, that's my observation, okay? But yeah, so Latin America, like many countries, do have a lot of natural resources, energy, minerals, things like that. So if the world is developing and you have the United States, and if you have like more countries like the United States or Japan financializing, who were once very competitive in exports, have to soak up the demand from a rising China, well, you understand that it's not sustainable to have like China, the United States, Japan, Europe, and all these like traditional automakers compete with China, because one, it's not sustainable, right? There always is a lot of demand on the demand side, and it's growing as countries develop, but you have to also consider things like climate change or carbon emissions. And you may feel like it doesn't matter. Some people don't, but but global economists, the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, they do care. So it's like it doesn't really matter how people individually feel politically about it. So, I mean, if we look at the United States here, right? And China's here. Japan was once in the position that China's in. Like, they're just very competitive in exports. They would weaken. I think they would weaken the yen. So their exports remain very competitive. And so a lot of the ways you see China developing now, it's SOEs, very competitive exports, and dominating things like chip manufacturing or automotive exports. It's kind of the same thing you see of China today. So just think about 70s Japan and China today, and it's like you'll see like the similarities. And I'm sure, Vietnam is next, right? But it's not sustainable to have like the United States dominate in automotives, and it's not sustainable to have Japan, South Korea, China, Mexico, and like Canada. And like it's you can't. I mean, you could, right? But there's a finite amount of demand, sort of. Well, there's a lot of demand, but there's a finite amount of like capacity which can be done. So I think that rather than have the United States try to dominate the global markets through traditional means, you're probably just going to have the similar thing where Japan started building their factories in the United States, and the same thing with China. You'll have Chinese automotives start forming joint ventures in the United States and start building factories in the United States instead. And you can balance things like the profit margins by, like if you look at Tesla, for example, the most profitable Teslas are made in China, not the United States, but the net total sales and the company reporting financial earnings will generally have like, it won't really differentiate between like the profit margins made in like Texas or or Nevada or California and China. I mean, you can look at that, but on a financial earning or stock price won't really consider that too much, right? I mean, if you're an investor, you might, but there's a lot of companies like that in general that a lot of their profit margins are made here, in the developing world, and it's a lot of their profit margins are made from the demand side in the developed world, right? So yeah, if you look at Tesla, I think it's a great example of like Chinese electric vehicles. Or if you look at like not Polestar, but yeah, you could look at like that's the way a lot of Chinese electric vehicles will go. Like, and if you look at a lot of the Chinese electric vehicles, it kind of seems like some of them, like NIO, for example, was made for the United States markets, or like maybe BYD, for example. Like a lot of these companies, it seems like they were made for the U.S. markets, and they wanted to expand into the U.S. markets because that's where the highest profit margins are, and that's where like the demand is. And so I could see over time rather than the United States try to fight China in any way, it'll just go like any other industry, like in Japan, or like the solar industry, or like the chip manufacturing industry. Like China will just form joint ventures and partnerships with the United States. And so while that's happening, you do want to organize your economy to handle that, right? And you do want to change up like your agriculture and how like you're farming. And if Japan, for example, like they don't want to be left behind, and if they can't be as competitive in their exports, then they can own the supply chain, right? So they can own like Nippon Steel. Nippon Steel can acquire U.S. Steel, and maybe the United States can, unfortunately, take over, or not take over, but they can build more. They can expand into Latin America to do resource extraction or energy extraction through like companies like Chevron, and build infrastructure here. And yeah, they can unfortunately take parts of Greenland, for example, where there's minerals and energy rich resources, and then build a plant that's a joint venture between like a Chinese and a United States electric vehicle company, like Ford and NIO do a partnership, or Ford and BYD, and they build things like battery plants and electric vehicles in Texas or North Carolina or South Carolina, or on the Rust Belt, right? Or in Toronto or in Ohio, because they can ship things all throughout the Great Lakes, right? And there's just a lot of things you can do. But yeah, that's kind of how I see things going. I think that when the deals are made, when the stars align, right? Like, so the infrastructure is made, different countries have their investments in the right area, the infrastructure is ready to accommodate it. I think you'll see that the lower interest rates by the United States increases global liquidity, which allows for the global economy to run on all four cylinders again, or six cylinders. And from the very lowest of the value production to the highest, you'll see like the demand side rise along with global production rise, along with like global liquidity increasing as well, and interest rates lowering down as well. And then that's when you'll probably see like Chinese electric vehicles in America or in Canada, right? And it makes sense to me, because like if you are in Montreal or something, or if you're in like Vermont, you're going to want a Chinese electric vehicle company to open its plant. But the Chinese electric vehicle company is going to want the United States to lower interest rates so that there's more global liquidity. And when you have more low global liquidity, these Chinese companies can raise capital on the U.S. markets through things like the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange through their ADRs, and companies like NIO can raise capital from United States investors and Western investors, or anyone, and they can start building their factories here with minimal risk, because they're using U.S. capital in the form of labor and financial means and resources. And they can expand the company's revenue by having access to the Western market now. And everyone wins, because China might financialize more, and they'll move away from like real estate speculation into a little more of like stock market and equities and securities, things like that. And their bond market will develop more, and their financial markets will develop more as a result. But when you have like two countries like Canada and the United States making deals with China and being on better terms, like these countries like Japan don't want to be left behind, so they join in the supply chain. So like Japan acquiring Nippon Steel, maybe Japan and South Korea forming more joint ventures with Chinese companies as well. So at least as the pie increases, everybody has a hand in the pie, right? Because nobody wants to be left behind. And so you can lower interest rates, increase the money supply, and at the same time reduce the cost of living by just lowering tariffs or having a surplus of goods. And when you change the way the agriculture is made, when you reduce trade barriers, and you reduce tariffs and sanctions, and you increase the demand side, or if the demand side stays relatively the same but ever growing, but the supply side grows, then you can still lower interest rates but still have the cost of living go down as well. So you can have deflation because you can export deflation from other countries into the United States. So I think that's generally how it's going to happen. It's just that, yeah, unfortunately, like countries like Venezuela offer things like cheap labor, minerals, resources, energy. I don't really know if this is going to happen, but places like Greenland are also rich as well in resources. So yeah, I mean, the United States wants to position itself to benefit from lower interest rates, more liquidity, and more global production. So yeah, let's see. I don't know if this is gonna work. Oop. So yeah, after like I could see interest rates lowering, but at the end of things, like countries generally want lower interest rates. They can't. When the United States raises rates, it makes it harder for countries to pay its debts. It makes it less attractive to borrow in U.S. dollars. Let's see. So the global M2 money supply is generally going to grow, and that'll be good for the global economy. When I look at Bitcoin, I kind of look at it like there's two ways you can look at it. You can look at it like a hedge against inflation, but I'm wondering if it's more so a way for the United States or other countries to control labor supply. So there's a very small amount of people who own majority of the Bitcoin, but a lot of retail investors in Western countries or globally are like anywhere from the ages of like 18 to 40 or something. I don't know. I'm just hypothetically, right? If you want to decrease the labor force, you can pump up assets that these ages generally like to hold, like Bitcoin or meme stocks or things like that. You can pump up this and make it act like a UBI in a sense. And so governments can be like, at this moment in time, we need to raise rates, we need to decrease demand, or we need to decrease the supply side, we need to, the job growth isn't that good. So if Bitcoin does well, then you can kind of use it like a UBI, sort of like how you see like the AI stocks hold up the S&P 500 in the United States markets. Like you can use like higher asset paper values to control the labor side. So maybe when global liquidity increases, and the United States needs more laborers, and the global society and the global economy needs more laborers, maybe Bitcoin will drop because then it'll force people to go back to work. So I think that's one of the most amazing things about Bitcoin, how global leaders can use Bitcoin as a way to control the global labor supply. So, right, like things like the NASDAQ or the S&P 500, they kind of act like a UBI. Eventually, you want other countries to financialize more as well as the global economy develops. M2 money supply has started to grow in this year alone. We'll have to see how that goes, but it's not really too bad. Like, I understand the value of the dollar dropping is viewed as a bad thing, but it's not bad if the cost of living goes down. You also have to consider things like demographics, right? Like, so as like old elderly demographics die, then maybe you don't really need to have, like, maybe assets and resources get freed up, right? I don't want to get too much into that, but something to consider. So you can have all these kinds of assets, propped up for now to hold the financial markets. That you can have the economy propped up, which acts like a UBI for now. And also, when you have like the S&P 500, and you have like AI bubbles. If if China or any other country moves away from like U.S. treasuries and they buy into like higher performing assets like United States tech stocks or United States companies, or rather than like iRobot, for example, rather than have that, maybe like Chinese creditors can like can acquire the underlying company instead. That's good for China, and they can deleverage from moving from like U.S. Treasury and U.S. debts in the form of treasuries into like underlying companies and underlying assets instead, which is a little bit safer and gives them way more power in negotiations. Also, too, with the way that the United States is structured, where it's financialized, other countries can threaten the United States through economic means by like crashing the markets or raising their rates to crash the markets to get what it wants rather than other means. So when you look at things like global development, right? The United States is generally pretty clean, okay? You have some parts here, but for the most part, it's a very clean area. This is the air quality. And, visiting like different parts of Asia, especially like, Vietnam, the air is really bad for the most part. And so when we see things like, consider things like climate change, global warming, air quality, pollution, again, like people in the United States and developed countries take it for granted that we export a lot of our pollution and CO2 emissions and production to other countries. So I don't really see the United States, bringing back all these types of like second and third world country types of production. But yeah, you're gonna want Chinese electric vehicles and solar panel manufacturing and like all these other types of like higher quality, less pollutive types of production, which have higher value and higher profit margin opportunities in the United States. So if you look at Asia, for example, look at China, look how dirty the air is here. And it's real, like the water temperature, the temperatures, the water rising, the pollution, the air quality, like we take it granted for in Western countries, but these things really do matter, and it's really bad. Eventually, right? If you look at Japan, you look at the United States, like over time, as they move up from like second and third world to first world, you would hope that the pollution goes down, and they export their pollution towards other countries, or by then you can move from like, rather than use fossil fuel internal combustion engine, you move to like green energy, and so you can like control how the pollution is made or minimize CO2 production. Also too, it's like the way that the United States and much of the world is structured right now, internal combustion engine, oil production, and all these things, like you would want to move towards cleaner energy and cleaner means of production, but it's not in everyone's best economic means to do so right now. Eventually it'll change, but like if you want to change the United States from internal combustion to electric vehicle and hybrids, like you can't do that overnight, because there's a $1 trillion industry that if you upset it, then millions of people could die, or billions. So you have to do these things gradually over time, but you also maybe need some distractions as these things occur. So yeah, pollution is real, okay? So you have to consider that, why certain things can't happen overnight. We wish they could, and they will, and it'll probably move faster as the world develops, but it's not easy to change an entire economic system and society overnight. These things take time, and relatively, when we consider history, it's gone better, right? So yeah, the sustainable development goals do matter. No poverty. If you have poverty, then there's more instability and harm. If you have hunger, then people mass migrate. good health, well-being, quality education, clean water and sanitation. Like you want all these things for a sustainable world, because if you don't, well, then people do die. So which countries? Yeah, we don't really need to look into that too much. But so yeah, when you look at like Venezuela's gross domestic production, I believe that they're sanctioned a lot as well. We do see that their GDP was rising per capita, and I'm sure it will over time as well. But unfortunately, as the world develops, it seems like the world has to be ready to soak up the demand side, not just from China, but from Vietnam, from India, from Thailand, from Russia, from Saudi Arabia, Africa, Latin America. Like, the supply side is going to be growing, the global production is going to be growing. This has to happen, or the world will move away from the United States. Okay, so the United States has to lower rates, it has to increase global liquidity, it has to increase its demand side, the world has to be ready for countries moving from third to second and second to first. So, I guess that's just how things are going to have to work. Like, countries want to increase their rent seeking, they want to increase their financial markets. So yeah, that's how I view it personally. I mean, my opinions we can change, but it's just a quick overview and a sharing of my opinion on something that's much more complex. So I think over time I'll make a video that's a little bit more, but I just want to go over my thoughts. And when I was thinking about Trump, I don't necessarily think he's anti-China at all. Actually, I think he's very much a globalist, and I'll make a video about that. So yeah, no, this is financial advice. Please do your own research, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.